Hello and welcome to Sheffield Live. You are watching African Voices with me, Bailo Jallo and Dr. Kululeku Sibanda. And on today's show, we'll be focusing on South Africa as the country recently held its presidential election. However, before we begin, it's a pleasure for me to introduce some of the people I have here tonight. And that is nobody but Mbali Pewa, who is a PhD candidate and also a South African. So welcome Mbali Pewa to the show.
Thank you.
And as you can see next to Mbali Pewa, I don't need much introduction, but our usual Chiwe Chihana, who is usually sat next to me, but today she's on the other side as she was also a student in South Africa and also originally from Southern Africa, to be specific, Zambia, as many of you know. And yes, so welcome guys. Doctor?
Yeah, look, it's an exciting period. South Africa has gone through a long journey since the end of apartheid. We've had an election. Any thoughts?
Wow. So the initial thought is the ANC won the elections, but it's with a reduced majority of 57.5%, which is a majority, but not an overwhelming majority for the ruling party. So it has some work to do to regain support from people that it has lost.
Talking of that though, as you mentioned, it's a reduced majority. And since the end of apartheid in 1994, the ANC has been enjoying an overwhelming majority by winning more than 60%. But this time the percentage has reduced by more than 4%, to be specific, up to 5%. So does that give the ANC a worry, something to think about?
I think it would give any political party a worry if you start to decrease in the number of supporters that you have. For the ANC, it's been gradually going down since 1994. And currently they're entangled within, I think we have a commission, a state capture commission, so the public is aware of the amount of corruption that is being exposed in the ANC. So you've got people who are making judgments about what's happening, and it's showing in the ballot paper.
Chiwe, it's important two things there that Mbali raises. The question of corruption in Africa, but also the question of declining support. And I think that in the minds of the political leadership in Africa, what is important here, and I'm wondering what your thoughts will be, is whether or not the decline, people expected Ramaphosa to kind of make some difference for the ANC. It doesn't look like it's going in the direction. What would account for that?
I'm totally with you. We all expected that the ANC would actually have higher numbers. I mean, yeah, well, you would expect the ruling party, as often seen, to be doing well, but the statistics are I think that these statistics are worrying. And I think in large part, the problem is that the opposition has not sold itself as well as it could have done, in particular the leading opposition party, which is the Democratic Alliance. Given that we've had the whole Jacob Zuma saga, we've had poverty statistics rising, we've had unemployment rates in South Africa rising, the DA literally just got about the same statistics as the last election. In fact, they've even lost some seats to the EFF. So the leading opposition party in this case, I think, has failed to capitalize on a very good opportunity. They failed to convince the public.
So will you say is the ruling party has declined, likewise the main opposition, because they have declined as well by 2%. So will you say here the EFF has kind of enjoyed a kind of popularity, and some of what they are preaching or what they are saying is kind of sinking in?
I would actually like to think that the EFF have the policies of the EFF and the language that the EFF is speaking at the moment is feeding quite well into the change across the world where you have populist politics. But they speak for the people who are seen to be experiencing the most poverty, and that's the black population of South Africa. And so that resonated. I mean, previously the EFF had around 22 MPs in Parliament, but when you look at this past election, they've gained almost double what they had before. So definitely they're doing something that's resonating with the people, and they're taking away, they're pinching away at the ANC's numbers, and also they've pinched off a little bit of the DA's numbers.
Mbali, let's talk about here, as we've started with the EFF. You are South African.
Yes.
And what does it mean for ordinary South Africans looking at the EFF, its leader, Julius Malema, who is formerly an ANC party member? So now he is in the EFF, and some of what he is saying, even though controversial to some, but in terms of South Africans in general, how do they consider him?
Julius Malema is a radical figure. He's controversial, he's divisive. As South Africans, Parliament has become an interesting space to watch, just because of how the EFF is so upfront, it's so confrontational. It changes how politics used to be in South Africa. So we look at him as someone who's active, who's driving what people are saying on the ground in terms of change. But he's also a figure that at times could be too radical, where there are instances where it's, if this doesn't happen, we'll have violence. So his approach is one that we sometimes think, maybe not right now, but he is a noise that South Africa does need, because currently South Africa is not doing well economically. We've got a high unemployment rate, and something needs to change.
You say that he's divisive. I mean, and you talk about, you make reference to instances of feelings or notions that you cannot easily associate him with violence. As it happens, this morning I watched a video where he completely denounces the whole notion of violence. Julius Malema is never going to try to take over the state using the streets, which I find very the antithesis of radicalism. A radical leader says that if you go south, if you disregard the people's rights, the Constitution allows the public to demonstrate, and that would be constitutional. But Malema's view on that would be that the people of Sudan did something wrong by going on the streets. The people of Nigeria did something by going on the streets. He thinks that somehow undermines the Constitution. So from that perspective, I'm wondering why you think he's divisive, and also why you associate him with violence.
It's twofold.
Yeah.
One of it, there are land policies of taking from one without compensating and giving it to somebody else. That in itself is a form of violence. The second one is, we have instances in certain industries where there are conflicts, where there are racist clashes. And Malema's approach, or let me not say Malema, but EFF's approach is going to that institution and protesting in that particular space, where there could be other more formal dialogue, other channels that can be used. So he is an upfront person who is aggressive, and his party is that.
Okay, I get that reference to violence, but he also made reference to that violence being one-sided. I mean, if one is reacting to the violation of rights of people in work, and they do that by public demonstration, or if one says that the manner in which land was acquired in South Africa requires an equal action in the opposite direction. My feeling is that therefore the reference to violence may remain just one-sided, whereas I see violence on both sides here. I see violence on the part of an employer who doesn't respect the rights of the employee, and also on the part of one who owns too much land they don't use and may have historically gained that land in a manner that wasn't, in a manner of speak, that wouldn't be legal today.
So it wouldn't. We are in South Africa is a democratic country now.
Yeah.
So we've got laws and legislations that run the country. So the manner that the land was taken, it doesn't a direct and opposite force of that doesn't need to be implemented now.
Let me fire salvo.
Yes.
The United States has regarded itself as a democratic country for 200 years. And yet, it's not until the 1960s that you stop segregation. And the laws in that country, which were constitutional, parliamentary, recognized both segregation and at some point even slavery, right? And how do we move away from an unfair legal system, an unfair history, if we didn't challenge that head on? Are we saying that South Africa or our society has reached the maximum point at which change is no longer necessary? Are there things that we still need to do to change our society? I was looking at a picture last week that broke my heart into shreds of an aerial picture of South Africa. On the one hand was one suburb, and just across the road was another.
I think what you've done, Kululeko, is that you've made Mbali's statement sound like she was saying exclusively that the EFF has radicalized the political scene in such a way that they're not actually being realistic. No, but that's not what she was saying. I think you've put things at polar opposites, which is not exactly what she was saying. She was saying the manner in which they are influencing policy is one that does not discourage an act of physical violence. So when you talk about economic violence, that's a whole different ballgame. And again, I think you preempted what she would probably have said about land rights, perhaps.
Well, what I'm looking at here, I don't want us to just only focus on one political party, because the show is about South Africa, its election. I want us to focus on the whole of South Africa.
Arguably.
I do think we even went into the territory of reparations. I think Kululeko was heading there when South Africa had the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, which is totally different. So America has not yet had that.
So let's reverse back to where we were. We are going off topic a little bit. As much as we would like to give the EFF much of a chance or kind of to be on the show, let's focus on the whole of South Africa. So, Chiwe, you interjected there. So let's talk about, we've had how the election has passed.
Absolutely.
We've seen prior to the election some of the challenges that South Africa faced. We've seen the recent election, and prior to Cyril Ramaphosa coming into power, we know what happened with Jacob Zuma and some of the corruption which is kind of rampant across the continent. But when Ramaphosa took over, he promised changes, and just recently again, after being re-elected, he's promised there will be changes. So what do you think here should be his priority?
Wow, what should Cyril Ramaphosa? I think poverty levels in South Africa are growing. Youth unemployment statistics are hanging above 55%. I think those should be the priorities. And when you actually look at these statistics by demographics, it's predominantly the Black, indigenous South African population that is affected. But remember, the ANC of Nelson Mandela was a liberation party. It brought freedom to South Africans, and with that it came with promise. But 25 years on, we're still struggling with the same issues of, in fact, some of them are worse, like access to basics such as electricity. South Africa didn't have problems with electricity when I lived there, but now people are talking about load shedding. So very basic facilities, I think, are only limited to a few people, and Cyril Ramaphosa needs to get in touch with that. He's a millionaire. I feel like he's sometimes detached from the actual reality at the grassroots. Commenting
on that, Mbali, Chiwe mentioning he is a millionaire. Do you think some of these politicians are out of touch with reality?
I don't think most of them are out of touch with reality. After the elections, Cyril Ramaphosa said he will deal with corruption. That's his first thing that he will attack. I think we all hear about corruption in Africa. So I think what Cyril Ramaphosa is saying is that he'll root it out from local government, which will be a difficult task. We know that corruption really disadvantages poor people. So I don't think he's aware of what's happening. It's about having the political will to change the conditions on the ground.
And looking at that though, if he wants to change as much as he's wanting to change, from the top to bottom or from the bottom to top, do you think that will give him another challenge in terms of some of the political elite in the country? If he tries certain things, because as we all know in Africa, certain things, when you try them, you don't get the support from the other side?
Well, he is the leader.
Yeah. As much as he is the leader, but there are certain things that he doesn't enjoy, isn't it? Because maybe through the party or maybe in South Africa in general?
Yes. So the ANC is currently facing internal battles where there's still a faction that is still clinging on to Jacob Zuma. So I think if he proposes...
That's the reason why I brought up that.
If he proposes changes, there will be a fraction. See, we don't know the dynamics now because now he's got a mandate. People have voted for him. It's not like when he came in because Jacob Zuma had stepped down. So I don't know the dynamics now, but there is a fraction that may contest what he proposes, and that is an internal challenge that we as South Africans know about.
You know what's interesting about that, Kululeko? In the same situation when Theresa May became Prime Minister soon after David Cameron, she stepped in after he stepped down. But she was keen to get a fresh mandate and called for an election. Do you remember that? So what kind of power does that give you? Because now, for once, Cyril Ramaphosa has legitimately been elected in his own name, in his own right. What, based on what Mbali has just said, what does that look like now? Does that empower him? Does that give him the sort of power that Theresa May seemed to have felt she got? Well, she had hoped for it, but she didn't get a very good voting percentage, though.
Look, my feeling is that Cyril Ramaphosa didn't need that. He's a trade unionist turned capitalist, which gives him a lot of power because he can sort of appeal to his trade unionist personality if he needs to deal with workers, and then he can also connect with the capitalists. I don't think that it made a huge difference. But if you look at the election result, he's lost about 19 seats coming in. It means that he cannot have a strong argument about his leadership being better than that of Zuma. But certainly he can, in my view, attempt to show himself as different by working a lot better in other fields, such as dealing with corruption. He needs to do something different that sets him apart. The election has failed to set him apart from Zuma. In fact, if anything, it has made him look weaker than Zuma in a number of ways.
Wow.
But looking at that, though, we've seen two issues here in the country. That is poverty and corruption, which is kind of similar to many African countries. So here, Zimbabwe is not far away from South Africa. You are neighbors. And looking at the dynamic of that area, South Africa has got lots of power and influence in that region. Do you think it needs to step up whatever it is doing in order to continue having that influence over that region? Because if poverty is increasing in the country, and many people go to South Africa sometimes to seek a better life, but if things are not that as good as the countries that they are living, because we've seen recently where black South Africans attacking other Africans.
Can I tell you something with South Africa, right? Things have deteriorated, but one thing you can't take away from South Africa is that whilst it was the wealthiest it had the best economy across the African continent. It's now second. So you can't take that away. But within the Southern African region, which you're referring to, South Africa remains a powerhouse and the biggest trading partner for most of the countries around it. So beyond so wherever the power sits, the financial power, economic power sits, that's where the shift needs to happen, because that's held by a minority. I think that's the biggest problem that leads to the poverty levels growing and not changing the statistics on the ground. So when you talk about the macro level, South Africa will be a power for a long time. But when you're talking about the micro and basic levels, maybe that's a different aspect, which I think Khululeko might be better versed at talking about than I am.
No, I think you're absolutely right. South Africa, in fact, it's arguably still the first economy if you're looking at income per person, per capita, rather than looking at GDP, because the population between Nigeria has 3 times population of South Africa and doesn't have 3 times the size of the economy of South Africa. So it's
arguable.
It's arguable.
It's in context.
But if you look at South Africa's infrastructure, it is world class, and that is what matters here. That is what will determine whether it remains world class and its influence. But also, it has one of the greatest tools. It has a democratic constitution, which will continue to mean that it has a lot of influence and can be listened to by the rest of the world. You run a very low risk of having a Zimbabwean scenario in South Africa under any circumstance, or a dictatorship. They have proportional representation, which will always prevent a one-party state scenario.
Well, so how do they need? What do they need to do in terms of the president in general, the ANC, in order for that poverty level to be reduced, and also for the economy to benefit everyone in the country? Because if you look at, they call it the Rainbow Nation, if I'm not mistaken, but the class in the country is kind of divided. The white people or the white minority are kind of like the upper class. Then Asians kind of like maybe in the middle class bit. Then the black Africans are in the lower class. So what does the country needs to do in order, or the government, in order for that economy to circulate to everyone, so that everyone can benefit from South Africa's wealth rather than just a few?
I think South Africa needs to be inclusive. I think the government needs to devise strategies of getting black people in the townships, black people in rural areas, and black people, the urban poor, into some form of employment. And another thing we haven't mentioned there is the quality of education in South Africa. That also needs to be looked at. If that is improved, and also the economic, those two things, then there can be a change.
And I suppose what you said earlier on about action at the local level, because that's what influences what happens there, isn't it? The power at the local level, where the people who are poorest actually live. How do you translate that into tapping into the mainstream economy?